Because human life is sacred to God, that means that all the dominoes that lead to life are also sacred. The physical union that produces life is sacred because it is how God has designed for life to enter into this world. You know, all of the thou shalt nots that the Bible has about that physical union that produces life, those aren't there to spoil mankind's fun. Those are there to protect the sanctity of that union. In the Old Testament, the ark was holy. The tabernacle was holy. In the days of Solomon, the temple was holy. And there were rules about who could go into the tabernacle and how far they could go and when they could go and what they had to do when they got there. And beyond the sacred veil was the Holy of Holies where the ark itself was kept. And there were a lot of rules about it, but it wasn't because there was anything wrong with the ark or with the Holy of Holies, the tabernacle. It was because it was to protect the sanctity of all of that. And in the same way, the physical intimacy that produces life is protected by wholesome rules. And when we treat them with the reverence that God intended, then it is beautiful and it is sacred. Genesis 2:24 says that a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And the Apostle Paul quotes that verse in Ephesians 5:31, and then he explains something deep. Now get this. He explains something so deep about that, the wisest man who ever lived, King Solomon himself, admitted that this was too deep for him to understand. At the end of the book of Proverbs, after spending a lifetime creating the most beautiful, inspired Proverbs, inspired of God, toward the end of the book, in chapter 30, he's written 30 chapters of the most profound wisdom that has ever been shared with mortal man. And then in verses 18 and 19, he lists just a handful of things that he admits toward the end of his life were too wonderful for him to fully fathom. And the last one that he says is the way of a man with a maid. Now remember, Solomon was a man who had had 1,000 maids. He's not talking about what a man does with a maid. He's talking about the why and the significance behind it. What is the meaning of it? Why did God do it this way? Plants don't. Why does God put it together this way? How does this produce life? The mystery of it was beyond him. But 1,000 years later, in Ephesians 5:32, Paul reveals the mystery. An insight Solomon never had. He quotes that Genesis passage about man leaving father, mother, cleaving to his wife, they being one flesh, and then he says this is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. The relationship between a man and his wife is a parallel of the relationship between the heavenly bridegroom and his bride. And the rapture that the church will someday experience with Christ at the resurrection, when we finally get to have perfect worship, perfect communion, perfect union with him, perfect intimacy with him, it is something that is beyond this world. And the closest thing that this world has on a physical level to even give us an idea of what it is like is the union of a man and wife. And therefore it is a sacred union. And all of those rules are to protect its sanctity. And the overarching rule that all the rest of them come under is that a man is restricted exclusively to the covenant of marriage between a man and his wife. And that brings us to our next domino. Life, the soul within you, life is sacred. Therefore, the union that produces life is sacred. Therefore, the covenant of marriage that sanctifies that union is sacred. In fact, we call it holy matrimony for this very reason. In Genesis 1:27, it says, God created man in his own image. And then it clarifies, male and female created he them. In other words, the man-woman relationship in marriage is the fullest expression of God's glory on earth, man and woman together. The sanctity of marriage transforms that which would have been sinful into something sacred, that which would have been cheap into something priceless, that which would have been a curse into a blessing.